Okay, hey, I'm back like 15 seconds after I push stop. It's time for reading some Warren Berger. I'm not actually sure that I got around to saying very explicitly that the reason that we're doing this at all, these videos, is because I'm gonna read to you. I love to do it, and I think that it's valuable to hear I think it's valuable to hear someone speak these words sometimes, especially when the language and the writing gets more complicated than we may be used to, especially during the summer, right? Because that's not like we're together and you can come and be like, oh my God, Dr. Holt, that made no sense to me. And I can be like, well, that's because he does. Let's look at why that might have been the case. Instead, you're off on your own, either getting frustrated or feeling dumb or I don't know, intimidated, none of which needs to happen. So I'm going to do some reading. You guys can read along with me and you can hear and see me stumble. It also means that I get to help in a way that doesn't really tell you what to think about this stuff. So I'm going to try really hard to hold off on the editorializing and just get started. So, A More Beautiful Question, The Power of Inquiry to Spark Breakthrough Ideas by Warren Berger. Our excerpt starts with chapter 2, called Why We Stop Questioning. Why do kids ask so many questions? And how do we really feel about that? Why does questioning fall off a cliff? Can a school be built on questions? Who is entitled to ask questions in class? If we're born to inquire, then why must it be taught? And finally, can we teach ourselves to question? Section number 1, why do kids ask so many questions and how do we really feel about that? A few years ago, the American comedian Louis C.K. wrote a bit for his stand-up act that focused on children and questioning. It starts with a description of a beleaguered mother and her young child at McDonald's. The child asks why the sky is blue, and the parent snaps, "Just shut up and eat your French fries." Louis explains to the audience that while this might seem to be harsh, the reality is you can't answer a kid's question. They don't accept any answer. If you do try to answer, you only end up caught in an endless circle of why questions, as he then demonstrates by recounting a conversation with his own young daughter. It starts innocently enough. "Papa, why can't we go outside?" But eventually Louis is asked to explain why it's raining, why clouds form, why he doesn't know why clouds form, why he didn't pay attention in school, why his parents didn't care about his education, and why their parents before that were just as bad. It devolves down to Louis trying to explain to his child why we're alone in the universe and nobody gives a shit about us. It ends inevitably with his telling his child, "Shut up and eat your French fries." The bit nicely captures a truth that any parent or anyone who's been around kids of a certain age has experienced many times over. What makes it funny, though, is the comedian's brutally candid description of how frustrating it can be to be on the receiving end of kids' questions. The adult in this case becomes exasperated, insecure, aware of his own ignorance, and reminded of his insignificance, all because of that word, why. As Louis C.K. makes clear, we may profess to admire kids' curiosity, but at some point we just don't welcome those questions anymore. Maybe we're simply worn out by the sheer volume of inquiry among young children. According to Paul Harris, a Harvard child psychologist and author, research shows that a child asks about 40,000 questions between the ages of 2 and 5. During that 3-year span, Harris says a shift occurs in the kind of questions being asked, from simple factual ones, like the name of an object, to the first requests for explanations by 30 months. By age 4, the lion's share of the questions are seeking explanations, not just facts. As this is happening, rapid brain growth is occurring. At the University of Washington, advanced brain scan technology shows connections forming in young brains. Some of the lab's work is featured in Tiffany Schlane's fascinating film, Brain Power, From Neurons to Networks. The lab's scans reveal an explosion of connections, synapses, between neurons in young children's brains, amounting to about 1 quadrillion connections, or more than 3 times the number found in an adult brain. Kids' brains are constantly connecting stimuli or thoughts, and as they're making these mental connections, they're seeking more information and clarification by way of questioning. not that it's easy for a child to ask a question. Harris has described it as a series of complex mental maneuvers. It starts with knowing that you don't know. The asking of a question also indicates that the child understands that there are various possible answers. When they ask what's for dinner, they can imagine that it might be soup or pasta, Harris writes in his book, Trusting What You're Told. Without the ability to conceive of more than one possible way that things might stand in the world, why ask questions? Lastly, it means children have figured out an efficient way to fill this gap in their knowledge by asking someone who might know. As children venture out into the world, synapses firing in their heads, they constantly encounter things they cannot classify or label. As the children's neurologist Stuart Mostofsky puts it, they have not yet developed mental models to categorize things. So part of what they're doing when questioning is asking adults to help them with this huge job of categorizing what they experience around them, labeling it, putting it in the proper file drawers of the brain. When innovators talk about the virtues of beginner's mind or neoteny, to use the term favored by MIT Media Lab's Joy Ito, one of the desirable things they're referring to is that state where you see things without labels, without categorization. Because once things have been labeled and filed, they become known quantities, and we don't think about them, may not even notice them. Somewhere between ages 4 and 5, children are ideally suited for questioning. They've gained the language skills to ask. Their brains are still in an expansive, highly connective mode, and they're seeing things without labels or assumptions. They're perfect explorers. The physicist Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about young children being scientists because they turn over rocks and mash things together. Harvard's Harris points out that they're also like anthropologists. They don't just conduct experiments. They ask the people around them questions. People tend to think that kids don't care much about the answers. That, as Louis C.K. suggests in his why routine, no matter what you answer, they're just going to ask why again. But they do in fact seem to care very much about the answers they get. A recent University of Michigan study found that when preschoolers ask why, they're not just trying to annoy adults or simply prolong a conversation. They're trying to get to the bottom of things. In the studies, when kids were given actual explanations, they either agreed and were satisfied, or they asked a follow-up question. Whereas if they didn't get a good answer, they were more likely to be dissatisfied and to repeat the original question. The NSED professor and questioning expert Hal Gregerson says that if you watch closely what's happening when kids ask adults questions, the reason kids ask why over and over again is often because we don't understand their questions, or we're just not listening. And by asking over and over, they're saying to us, in effect, you're not hearing me. You're not understanding what I'm asking. As children begin preschool, a curious change starts to happen around questioning. Preschoolers are entering a simulation-rich environment. Stimulation-rich environment, not simulation-rich. Preschoolers are entering a stimulation-rich environment, surrounded by other presumably inquisitive kids, with ready access to an adult question answerer known as a teacher, seemingly ideal conditions for questioning. Yet they immediately begin to ask fewer questions, according to Harris, who cites studies done in various cultures around the world, all showing the same result. He theorizes that a comfort factor is at work here. At home with a parent, children are more willing to share their questions than they are at preschool. But even so, preschoolers are still asking questions at a higher rate than older school kids. Most preschool environments are relatively unstructured and allow for more free-form play and exploration, which may be key to helping kids maintain their propensity to inquire and learn at this level. Interestingly, the more preschool models itself after regular school, the more it becomes a venue for loading kids up with information and feeding them answers to questions they have not yet asked, the more it seems to squelch their natural curiosity. The child psychologist Alison Gopnik has been outspoken in criticizing the trend of turning preschool into school, which she notes is driven by over-ambitious parents and, in the United States at least, by federal mandates requiring more standardized teaching in preschool. When we start teaching too much too soon, says Gopnik, we're inadvertently cutting off paths of inquiry and exploration that kids might otherwise pursue on their own. As Gopnik puts it, children are the research and development division of the human species. If they're permitted to do that research, to raise and explore their own questions, through various forms of experimentation and without being burdened with instructions, they exhibit signs of more creativity and curiosity. Gopnik says young kids learn in much the same way scientists do, by exploring and experimenting, and that we should be aware of trends toward more structured and academic early childhood programs. That academic rigor comes soon enough as students begin grade school, which is when questioning by kids really starts to disappear. Section 2. Why does questioning fall off a cliff? In 2010, Professor Kyung-Hee Kim at William & Mary College observed that results of creativity tests given at schools in the United States, using the well-known Torrance system, had begun to decline in 1990 and had been dropping since. This finding triggered a wave of articles in the US media, including a Newsweek cover story, The Creativity Crisis, which focused on the complex question of how to address this problem by doing a better job teaching creativity to children. Amid the article's deep discussion of creativity and neuroscience, covering neural networks, differences between right and left brain functions, and the relationship between divergent and convergent thinking, was a throwaway line buried deep in the piece that seemed to me to cut to the heart of the matter. Preschool children on average ask their parents about 100 questions a day. By middle school, they've pretty much stopped asking. If you chart what happens to kids questioning, and the Right Question Institute has done that using data from the 2009 US Nations Report Card, it looks as if questioning, denoted by the solid line in the chart, falls off a cliff, even as children's use of reading and writing skills steadily climbs through the school years. That steep decline in questioning might not be alarming in and of itself. One might conclude that children just don't need to question as much once they're reading and writing and texting and Googling. But the problem is, as kids stop questioning, they simultaneously become less engaged in school. When the engagement level of students is measured, as in a recent Gallup study, we see the same falling off the cliff phenomenon as students moved from elementary school through high school. When Gallup released the study in early 2013, at the same time as the American fiscal cliff crisis, the author Daniel Pink asked on his blog, "Does the student cliff matter more than the fiscal cliff?" This suggests there may be a relationship, which many teachers could tell you without needing to conduct a formal study, between students asking questions and their being engaged and interested in learning. Admittedly, there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation here. Do kids stop questioning because they've lost interest in school? Or do they lose interest in school because their natural curiosity and propensity to question is somehow tamped down? I've asked that question of a number of children's neurologists and psychologists, as well as teachers and education experts. Clearly, various factors can influence kids' question asking and their curiosity levels as they grow up. For instance, at around age 5, the brain starts trimming back some of those neural connections that were expanding so rapidly the first few years. This synaptic pruning could translate to less questioning and less wondering about the surrounding world. Also, as we develop mental models of that world with more categorization, more labels, we have less need to ask, what's this and what's that? But many educators and learning experts contend that our current system of education does not encourage, teach, or in some cases even tolerate questioning. Harvard's Tony Wagner says, somehow we've defined the goal of schooling as enabling you to have more right answers than the person next to you, and we penalize incorrect answers. And we do this at a pace, especially now in this highly focused test prep universe, where we don't have time for extraneous questions. Wagner told me that he often sits in on classes to observe the questioning dynamic. I was in a 7th grade science class, and this kid started asking all kinds of questions about the universe and stars, and the teacher was just trying to say, look, here are the planets, now memorize this. And this was powerful to me. The message was that in this class, we do not have time for questions, because that will take away time, that will take time away from the number of answers I have to cover. To be fair, many teachers feel helpless in the face of this. As one California high school teacher lamented, I have so many state standards I have to teach concept-wise. It takes time away from what I find most valuable, which is to have students inquire about the world. Dominic Randolph, principal of the Riverside Country School in New York uses the corporate term product-driven to describe many of today's schools. Under pressure to improve test scores, they've tried to instill business-like efficiency into a process designed to impart as much information as possible to students within a given time frame, leaving little or no time for student inquiry. When teachers are under this kind of pressure to follow mandated guidelines, it can cause them to be less receptive to students' ideas or inquiries, as one researcher demonstrated in a fascinating study. Susan Engel of Williams College did an experiment with two sets of teachers. One group was not given specific guidelines on how to teach a science class, while the other group was subtly encouraged to follow a worksheet. The first group of teachers tended to respond with interest and encouragement when students expressed their own ideas. The second group said things like, "Wait a minute, that's not on the instructions." Engel concluded that teachers are very susceptible to external influences. Their understanding of the goal of teaching directly affects how they respond when children spontaneously investigate. While some of the problems involving overloaded curriculum and teaching to the test seem to have been exacerbated in recent years, the more general problem of schools favoring memorized answers over creative questions is nothing new. Some point out that it's built into an educational system that was created in a different time, the industrial age, and for a different purpose. As a number of education critics have pointed out, schools in many industrialized nations were not, for the most part, designed to produce innovative thinkers or questioners. Their primary purpose was to produce workers. The author Seth Godin writes, our grandfathers and great-grandfathers built schools to train people to have a lifetime of productive labor as a part of the industrialized economy, and it worked. To create great workers, education systems put a premium on compliancy and rote memorization of basic knowledge, excellent qualities in an industrial worker. Or as the cartoonist and Simpsons creator Matt Groening puts it, it seems the main rule that traditional schools teach is how to sit in rows quietly, which is perfect training for grown-up work in a dull office or factory, but not so good for education, and not so good for questioning. To the extent a school is like a factory, students who inquire about the way things are could be seen as insubordinate. It raises, at least in my mind, a question that may seem extreme. If schools were built on a factory model, were they actually designed to squelch questions? Logically, as we move from an industrial society to more of an entrepreneurial one, it makes sense that we would want to trade in the factory obedience model of schooling for a more questioning model. But as the world changed and the workplace changed with it, the old educational model hasn't evolved much, and for the most part, hasn't adapted to the modern economy's need for more creative, independent thinking workers. Godin and others believe that in attempting to modernize old models of schooling, we should start by asking some basic questions about purpose. Godin offers up this query as a starting point. What are schools for? That question could also be phrased as, why are we sending kids to school in the first place? With all the current debate around education reform, discussions of conflicting models for schools, competing educational philosophies, differing ideas of how to test, design curricula, evaluate teachers, somehow the fundamental why questions, which can help frame a larger discussion, don't seem to come up much. If we don't stop to consider Godin's question, although there's no one answer to it, many would agree that at least part of the answer could be summed up as to prepare students to be productive citizens in the 21st century. That, in turn, raises another fundamental question. What kind of preparation does the modern workplace and society demand of its citizens? I.e., what kind of skills, knowledge, and capabilities are needed to be productive and to thrive? The answer to that, again, is not simple, but among those who've studied the needs of the evolving workplace from an educational standpoint, and two people at the forefront are Tony Wagner and John Seeley Brown, the consensus seems to be that this new world demands citizens who are self-learners, who are creative and resourceful, who can adjust and adapt to constant change. Both Wagner and Brown put questioning at the top of the list of key survival skills for the new workplace. As for skills not needed in the new environment, ability to memorize and repeat back facts, because as noted in the last chapter, new technology puts many of those facts at our fingertips, eliminating the need for memorization. Indeed, this prompts another of Godin's provocative questions. Should we abandon the failed experiment of teaching facts? If we simply zoom in on that one why question regarding the basic purpose of schools, and if we agree that one of their primary purposes is to enable a 21st century citizen to be a lifelong learner, able to adapt to constant change in the modern world, and if we also acknowledge that the ability to question effectively is among the most important of the critical skills needed, this question naturally arises. What if our schools could train students to be better lifelong learners and better adapters to change by enabling them to be better questioners? And this next question, how might we create such a school? To start answering those questions, attempting to envision a school of tomorrow with questioning baked in at its core, it is instructive to glance back at New York's Harlem neighborhood in the 1970s, where a substitute teacher turned principal named Deborah Meyer created a radical model for a school designed to foster inquiry. In education circles, Meyer, now in her 80s, is seen as a legendary figure. A pioneer of the small schools movement that emerged several decades ago, she was the first educator to receive a MacArthur Genius Award in recognition of her work at the groundbreaking Central Park East schools in New York. Today, Meyer remains involved with a number of schools she started in the Northeast and writes a popular blog about education, where she poses unfailingly interesting questions. Is a test-driven education the most likely path for producing an inventive and feisty citizenry? What would it look like? What would it look and sound like in the average classroom if we wanted to make being wrong less threatening? And this one, which I particularly like, what might the potential for humans be if we really encouraged the spirit of questioning in children instead of closing it down? I asked Meyer about that second question, and she said it originally popped into her head about 40 years ago when a third grade student at her Harlem school said to her, "What's different about this school is you're interested in what we don't know, not just what we do know." Meyer was very taken with that comment. It confirmed to her, more than any of the impressive test results her school was achieving, that she was doing what she'd set out to do when she started the Central Park East schools. Meyer opened the first of her schools in 1974 in a dilapidated old school building in East Harlem, an area that at the time epitomized the collapse of the New York City school system, according to Seymour Fleigel, a former school official in that district. Meyer was herself the product of a Tony New York private school education. After getting her master's degree, she eventually found herself teaching in a Chicago public school and was dismayed by the conditions. She began working on experimental approaches to education, which brought her to the attention of a New York school superintendent, who, faced with a desperate situation in Harlem, offered Meyer a chance to try out some of her ideas. Meyer felt that instead of just pushing information at kids, schools needed to teach them how to make sense of what they were being told, so they would know what to make of it and what to do with it. She said in an interview at the time, "My concern is with how students become critical thinkers and problem solvers, which is what a democratic society needs." 5 learning skills or habits of mind were at the core of her school, and each was matched up with a corresponding question. Evidence. How do we know what's true or false? What evidence counts? Viewpoint. How might this look if we stepped into other shoes or looked at it from a different direction? Connection. Is there a pattern? Have we seen something like this before? Conjecture. What if it were different? Relevance. Why does this matter? Meyer's core questions came out of her own connective inquiry. They blended elements of her early education in an ethical culture school with ideas she picked up from other well-known education innovators, including John Dewey, Jean Piaget, and Theodore Sizer. For settling on her 5 habits of mind, Meyer started with 2 particular ways of thinking she wanted to emphasize: skepticism and empathy. "I believe you have to have an open-mindedness to the possibility that you're wrong, or that anything may be wrong," she said. "I've always been very concerned with democracy. If you can't imagine you could be wrong, what's the point of democracy? And if you can't imagine how or why others think differently, then how could you tolerate democracy?" As Meyer established her question-based schools, the classes were run in unorthodox ways, with students given much more autonomy and freedom. Upon visiting in the late 70s, Flegel encountered an astonishingly rich educational program, which, for example, included extensive map making, studies of Native American woodlands culture in 17th century Harlem, Egyptian and Roman history, the Dutch settlement of New York, printing and newspapers, the emergence of cities, including a mini study of the neighborhood around the school, and African American history. A third grade class studying medieval society not only read books, but built castles and made armor, while a first grade class developed the idea of building a mythical city. Students were taken to the local museums and studied nature in Central Park. Meyer felt that outside the classroom, children tended to observe things more keenly and ask more questions. In some ways, Meyer was trying to extend the kindergarten experience through all grades. Teaching kindergarten was such an extraordinary intellectual experience, and I thought, why couldn't we just keep doing that? Only in kindergarten, she told me, do we put up with kids asking questions that are off topic. Meyer learned to listen carefully to students' questions, finding that they often contained insights that prompted her to rethink her own assumptions and occasionally reconsider the curriculum. We had one of those world maps with the US right in the middle. Remember those? And one of the students looked at it and said, how come the East Indies are in the West? And that question got me thinking about the impact of what you put in the center and what it does to everything else. And it became part of our curriculum. It had so many implications for how you see yourself. Perhaps not surprisingly, the students warmed to Meyer's approach, but the parents were another story. Some did not know what to make of the unorthodox lessons and the kids' autonomy. An environment such as the one Meyer created suggested to some a lack of discipline and structure. As Meyer pointed out decades later, however, while it's counterintuitive to many teachers and school administrators, often when you give kids more freedom to pursue what they're interested in, they become easier to control. The much harder thing is forcing them to sit still for 5 hours and pay attention to information they don't care about. The complaints at the time led to an inquiry. Flegel, who wrote about his experience several years later, was sent by the school superintendent to investigate. He came away thoroughly impressed and recommended that the school board back Meyer, which it did. In the years that followed, the remarkable success of the Central Park East schools became evident. Over the next decade, in a city with a dropout rate that ranged between 40 and 60%, only 1% of Meyer's students failed to finish secondary school. Meyer's question-driven schools struggled after she left, and there were few imitators until recently. Today around the world, a growing number of schools are embracing some of the principles Meyer was trying to teach. That students must develop the habit of learning and questioning, that knowledge cannot be force-fed to them. But such schools still represent a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall education system, notes Nikhil Goyal, New York-based author of a book on modernizing schools. Goyal began studying high schools while still attending one himself. A few years ago, when he was a 16-year-old junior at Long Island High School, he became frustrated with his uninspiring school experience and wondered, isn't there anything better than this? So he started examining other schools across the country. I met him when, at 17, he was in the midst of his research. He had found the Beautiful Question website, and since he loves asking questions, offered to be one of the site's inquiry researchers. But he helped me most in providing a crash course on the current state of inquiry-based schools. Goyal studied schools such as Brightworks and High Tech High, both in California, as well as a handful of others, some public, some private. He was well versed in the approaches of the famously successful schools of Finland and knew that Singapore schools were also breaking new ground. Among the schools he studied up close, Goyal was thrilled by what he found. Some of them had no grades, no tests, none of the memorization of facts that dominated his own school experience. Students got to work on interesting projects, sometimes of their own choosing, lasting for months. At Brightworks, the entire curriculum is based around big questions, Goyal said. Goyal said he thought one of the best things about these project-based or inquiry-based schools is that they got students to ask introspective questions, such as, what's interesting to me? Nobody's ever asked them that before, Goyal said. Many of the schools doing inquiry-based learning are still too new to judge whether they are turning out extra successful or productive adults, however one might measure that. But we do know that some of their core principles, the emphasis on letting students explore, direct their own learning and work on projects instead of taking tests, can also be found at Montessori schools, which have been around long enough to have a track record of adult success stories. and what a track record Montessori has. Today, so many former students of this private school system, which only teaches as high as 8th grade, are now running major companies in the tech sector, but these alumni have become known as the Montessori Mafia. Their ranks include Wikipedia founder Jimmy Wales, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, and the co-founders of Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. The former Google executive, Marissa Mayer, now the head of Yahoo, has said that Brin's and Page's Montessori schooling, though long ago, remained a defining influence. You can't understand Google unless you know that Larry and Sergey were both Montessori kids, according to Mayer. They're always asking, why should it be like that? It's the way their brains were programmed early on. Montessori is private, expensive, and exclusive. So are some of the other inquiry-based schools, and those that are public are few and far between. In terms of schools offering this approach, we're probably talking about less than 1% of the overall school system, Boyle points out. At the vast majority of schools, teachers who wish to encourage more inquiry by students must engage in small acts of defiance, going off script in their lessons, sometimes revising the standard tests and teaching materials. Don Mayer, a high school math teacher in New York, says a story in a popular TEDx talk about how he had to devise his own methods to encourage his students to ask their own questions and formulate their own problems. Mayer pointed out, Mayer, these people all have the same name. It's so crazy to read out loud and notice. Anyway, Mayer pointed out that a typical lesson on the problem of how long will it take to fill a water tank provides far too many tips and hints along the way. Mayer decided to eliminate all the sub-steps given to kids so they have to figure it out. Instead of telling them what matters, they need to decide what matters. At first, Mayer began to strip a lot of the text out of his teaching materials, giving kids less so that they would have to ask and think more. Then he came up with an even better idea. He showed his class a video of a water tank filling up, agonizingly slowly, he says. Students began to look at their watches, rolling their eyes, and they're all wondering at some point, man, how long is this going to take to fill up? That's how you know you've baited the hook. Who is entitled to ask questions in class? What Dan Mayer did in showing the video and then holding back as he waited for that question to form in students' heads was to transfer ownership. Instead of asking the question himself, he allowed students to think of it on their own, at which point it became their question. This is not insignificant for two reasons. As Mayer understood, if his student thinks of a question him or herself, it is likely to be of more interest than someone else's question. But this issue of who gets to ask the questions in class touches on purpose, power, control, and arguably even race and social class. Not arguably, it does touch on all of those things and comes directly out of all of those things. There's your Dr. Holt editorial. Denny Palmer Wolfe, a professor of education at Brown University, examined the role of questioning in schools for her academic paper, The Art of Questioning, and found that teachers tended to monopolize the right to question in classrooms. To the extent that students shared in that privilege, Wolfe cited research showing that it was the private preserve of a few, the bright, the male, the English-speaking. Moreover, Wolfe's research found that questions were often used by teachers primarily to check up on students, rather than to try to spark interest. Such questions were apt to leave a student feeling exposed rather than inspired. John Seeley Brown points out that questioning by students can easily come to be seen as a threat by some teachers. If you come from the belief that teachers are meant to be authoritative, then teachers are going to tend to want to cut off questioning that might reveal what they don't know. Deborah Meyer thinks the desire to control students and maintain order isn't necessarily coming just from teachers. At one point in my talk with her, I mentioned that today's business culture, with its ad messages promoting break the rules and think different messages, seems to embrace the same independent thinking ethos that Meyer tried to instill into grade schoolers in Harlem several decades ago. But when I suggested to Meyer that perhaps the establishment had caught up with her ideals, that with our new hunger for innovation, we might be more willing today to tolerate and possibly even teach questioning, she had her doubts. She believes we continue to live in a society that wants questions to be asked by some, but not others. Yes, we want a Silicon Valley, she said, but do we really want 300 million people who actually think for themselves? Another point of editorial. I was just reading a speech by Who was it by? James Baldwin, called A Talk to Teachers, where he digs specifically into this, specifically around how it has, well, how these ideas work together around race. So really fascinating. If you're looking for something good to read, it's like 7 pages. Do we really want 300 million people who actually think for themselves? When Meyer started teaching in urban schools, she was dismayed to find that low-income children in particular were trained not to ask questions in school. And she doesn't think that that has changed much in the ensuing years. The discouraging may not be deliberate in most cases. Teachers under pressure to cover more material, and particularly those in underfunded, overcrowded urban schools, can face formidable challenges in trying to manage large classrooms. The imperative to maintain order and just get through the lesson can be at odds with allowing kids to question. But other subtle forces may be conspiring against student questioning. For instance, children may be self-censoring their questions due to cultural pressures. Joshua Aronson of New York University has studied some of the difficulties that low-income minority students face, such as the disproportionate tendency of schools to suspend African-American boys. But Aronson has also conducted interesting research on what he calls the stereotype threat. It zeroes in on the psychology of stigma, in particular the way human beings respond to negative stereotypes about their racial or gender group. Aronson studied standardized test performances among Black, Latino, and female college students, and his findings suggest that when a person perceives him or herself as the target of a well-known stereotype, i.e., e.g., girls aren't good at math, it can have an adverse effect on performance in school. Would students who are battling against stereotypes be less inclined to interrupt lessons by asking questions, revealing to the rest of the class that they don't know something? Absolutely, Aronson said. Fear is the enemy of curiosity. Unfortunately, if you're in that situation, you may feel pressured to look a certain way to others. That can cause students to act as if they already know or just don't care. You're inclined to play it safe, Aronson says, rather than risk the possibility of confirming the stereotype. Parents, too, undoubtedly play a role in determining which kids ask questions in school. A recent study of 4th and 5th grade students by Indiana University sociologist Jessica McCrory-Calarco found that students from families with higher incomes were more likely to be encouraged by their parents to ask questions at school, whereas children from modest backgrounds were encouraged by their parents to be more deferential to authority and to try to figure things out for themselves instead of asking for help. Even very shy middle-class children learned to feel comfortable approaching teachers with questions and recognize the benefits of doing so, Calarco reports. Working-class children instead worried about making teachers angry if they asked for help at the wrong time or in the wrong way, and also felt others would judge them as not smart if they asked for help. These differences, Calarco found, stem directly from what children learned from their parents at home. Deborah Meyer, however, bristled at those findings. The study makes it sound as if those lower income parents are wrong, but they're not wrong, she said. They know that if their kids ask questions, they might get in trouble. They're telling their children to be careful in school. The middle class kids are in a different situation, Meyer notes. They go to school feeling safe, and because they feel safe, they can take the risk of raising their hands. But even the safe middle class student who has been encouraged by parents to question may still find that the typical classroom environment doesn't stimulate curiosity or inspire inquiry. One of the master questioners I interviewed was a 15-year-old high school student, Jack Andraka, who, through his own remarkable journey of inquiry, was able to develop a new, highly effective and inexpensive way to screen for certain types of cancer. The full story of how Andraka used questions to solve the problem is in the next chapter. I was curious whether someone such as Andraka, who clearly is inclined to question, learned to do so in school, and whether he tended to ask a lot of questions there. He said his parents taught him to question. They would ask me questions, and they would get me to ask them questions, but then they would never answer the questions they guided me to, Andraka told me. They would instead have me go and explore through experiment or personal experience and make hypotheses. At school, which Andraka described as your ordinary public high school located in Maryland, we really do not have students ask enough questions and do enough exploration by themselves. The teacher tells you what to do and you do it. You're really restricted within these tight guidelines. In my opinion, that's not the best way to learn. I asked Andraka whether his classmates asked a lot of questions. In my high school, to be quote unquote cool, you're typically very quiet and sit in the corner. You might snicker among your friends every now and then. So that to me is pretty boring. As for himself, Andraka said, either I'm extremely quiet and working on something else, like trying to find a new way to test for pancreatic cancer, for example, or I'm basically answering every single question, but I don't like questions like, what would happen if this happens? I do that on my own. I do all of my exploring outside of school. Because in school it's not allowed, and that just really sucks. Even if a born and bred questioner such as Andraka isn't asking questions in school, it suggests a fundamental problem. Dan Rothstein and Luz Santana of the Right Question Institute say it's no mystery what's going on. Even in the most progressive schools, questioning is still primarily the domain of the teacher. Questions are used a lot in the classroom, but it's mostly one way, says Rothstein. It's not about the student asking. It's about the teacher prompting the student by using questions that the teacher has formulated. By taking this approach, Rothstein says, teachers have inadvertently contributed to the professionalization of asking questions, to the idea that only the people who know more are allowed to ask. After 2 decades of studying and teaching questioning, Rothstein and Santana hope their 3-year-old Right Question Institute, young as a toddler and just as enamored of questions, can help shift the balance of power in classrooms by putting the kids in charge of the questions. If we're born to inquire, then why must it be taught? When the Boston High School teacher Ling Se-Pete used the Right Question Institute's question forming technique for the first time in her humanities class, she began by laying out a provocative premise to her 25 students. Torture can be justified. In the parlance of Rothstein and Santana, this opening statement is known as a Q focus because its purpose is to provide a focal point for generating questions from the students. Pete's class was divided into small groups, and each group's initial task was to come up with as many questions as possible within a time limit pertaining to that statement. After reviewing a set of rules, write each question down, don't debate or try to answer questions, just keep trying to think of more questions. The students in each group began to come at that premise from a variety of angles. Some questions aimed at bringing clarity to the issue. How do you define torture? When is torture used? Some were offbeat yet intriguing. Can torture make you happy? Other questions expanded the scope of the discussion. Does torture have anything to do with justice? Who are most likely to be tortured? The kids had no experience doing this type of questioning exercise, but according to Pete, after some initial reservations about the rules, some felt that questions ought to be answered as soon as they were raised. The questions began to flow freely within each group, and with each written down by a group member. Then the students were directed to the second stage of the exercise. They were instructed to change open questions to closed ones, and vice versa. So that, for example, an open question that began as, why is torture effective, might be changed to a closed one, is torture effective? The purpose of this part of the exercise, according to Rothstein, is to show that a question can be narrowed down in some cases or expanded in others. As students do this, he says, they begin to see that the way you ask a question yields different results and can lead you in different directions. Next, the students were asked to prioritize their questions, to figure out which 3 were the most important to move the discussion forward. Rothstein and Santana stress the importance of this convergent part of questioning. They feel it's not enough to encourage students to toss out questions endlessly. To question effectively, they must learn how to analyze their own questions and zero in on ones they would like to pursue further. Some of the questions from the student groups that made it through to this final stage included, why does torture work? Who decides whether torture should be justified or not? How can someone's pain be the price for the outcome, for the outcome you want? By the end of the session, Rothstein observed some of the kids looked spent. The process is difficult, he acknowledges, because it requires them to do something they've never done, to think in questions. But in this class and in others where the Right Question Institute's technique has been tried, a high level of engagement among students has been observed. This may be partly because Rothstein and Santana cleverly designed the process with game-like rules. Only questions allowed, any non-questions must be turned into a question, that inject an element of play into it. and perhaps questions by their very nature, invite and allow for more participation by more kids throughout the class. You don't have to know the answer to ask a question, so the smart kids don't dominate. Rothstein thinks it also has something to do with the students' tendency to quickly become invested in the questions they've thought of on their own. The ownership part of this is very important, he said. We've had kids say that when you ask your own questions, you feel like it's your job to get to the answer. The question process Rothstein and Santana developed was years in the making. It didn't start out being for kids in school. It was originally intended to help adults use questioning more effectively in their dealings with government bureaucrats, doctors, landlords, and school officials. Luis Santana knew from firsthand experience that those who don't know how to ask the right questions are vulnerable to being denied that which they might need or are entitled to have. Santana migrated to the United States from Puerto Rico when she was in her 20s, and after initially being on welfare, found a job working in a factory. Then I got laid off, she told me, and as I tried to navigate the social services system to get into a job training program, I was denied. Santana didn't know how to properly inquire as to why she was turned down. I didn't know how to advocate for myself, she says. She was fortunate that as she was being denied, another social worker intervened on her behalf, pointing out that Santana actually was qualified for the program. Santana entered the training program, got a job, simultaneously went back to school, and eventually earned a master's degree. But she never forgot that early lesson about the need for people, especially those disadvantaged, to be able to effectively speak up for themselves. She ended up going into social services work herself as a housing advocate in the city of Lawrence, Massachusetts. There she met Rothstein, who had a very different background, Kentucky bred, Harvard educated, but similar interests. Rothstein had gotten his doctorate in education at Harvard, where he was intrigued by this question. What can the people thinking about social problems or making social policy learn from the people who are actually affected by those problems? As Rothstein gravitated toward urban policy work, he became a director of neighborhood planning in Lawrence and met Santana at a gathering on housing problems in the city. Toward the end of that meeting, from the periphery of the room, Santana raised her hand and asked whether the city was getting enough input from the people actually affected by the housing problems being discussed. And I thought that would have been a great question to start the meeting with, Rothstein recalls. Subsequently, Rothstein asked for Santana's help with the launch of a high school dropout prevention program in Lawrence. While working on the program, they became aware of a particular obstacle. Parents clearly needed to be more involved in their children's education and in school policies affecting those kids, yet many of the parents refused to attend school meetings. Rothstein and Santana logically asked why. They told us they didn't go to the meetings because they didn't even know what questions to ask, Rothstein recalls. This was a light bulb moment for the two of them. What if we could find a way to help parents ask better questions at school meetings? They had their what if question, but as they proceeded to the how stage of trying to act on it, they took a wrong turn. Rothstein and Santana thought the most effective way to help parents ask better questions at school meetings would be to supply them with those questions. So the two of them began compiling questions for various situations, questioning school budgetary decisions, questioning why a child was being suspended, etc., and gave them to the parents to take to the meetings. We went to one of the meetings where the parents had these question lists, Santana recalls, and they'd go up to the microphone and read questions from the list. But as soon as they were asked a question by someone from the school, they'd turn back to us like, what do I do now? Santana says she and her partner quickly understood their mistake. We realized that the parents needed to think on their own and come up with their own questions. Rothstein and Santana began coaching parents how to do that. In particular, they taught them how to inquire about school decisions that most affected them, which meant probing the reasons behind the decisions, the process that led to those decisions, and the role parents could play in that process. As the program went along, a few parents revealed something surprising. They were using these same questioning techniques in other situations outside the school meetings, while trying to get information from a doctor in the emergency room or in settling a dispute with a landlord. This led Rothstein and Santana to begin to expand their question teaching process and try it out in a variety of situations. They began working with health clinics, social services agencies, and adult education programs around the country. They found that their questioning techniques were being used by immigrant parents in New Mexico, residents at a homeless shelter in Louisville, and sugarcane plantation workers in Hawaii. Rothstein and Santana formed a nonprofit organization, which in 2011 came to be known as the Right Question Institute. As their questioning technique was slowly gaining traction in adult education programs, something interesting happened. Adult ed teachers reported that some adult students, upon learning the technique, were wondering, why didn't I learn this in high school? Which in turn led to another what if moment for Rothstein and Santana. What if we take our adult question formulation program and adapt it for school-aged kids? Rothstein and Santana then designed a program for K-12 classrooms, broken down into a series of steps. Teachers design a question focus, like torture can be justified. Students produce questions. No help from the teacher, no answering or debating the questions. Write down every question, change any statements into questions. Students improve their questions, opening and closing them. Students prioritize their questions. They are typically instructed to come to agreement on 3 favorites. Students and teachers decide on next steps for acting on the prioritized questions, and students reflect on what they have learned. The process is designed to be simple enough that teachers can learn it in an hour and students can grasp it immediately. However, making it simple was hard. That basic formula took about a decade to produce. The RQI technique has drawn widespread praise from teachers. When her students start thinking in questions, observes the Boston High School teacher Marcy Osberg, it seems to unlock something for them. Rothstein says teachers have been lining up for RQI sessions at teacher conferences. When they come to the sessions and learn about it, he said, they're slapping their heads and saying, how come we've never done this before? The social critic Neil Postman wondered about this more than 2 decades ago when he wrote about the importance of questioning in education and posed this query of his own. Is it not curious then that the most significant intellectual skill available to human beings is not taught in schools? Rothstein was asked in a newspaper interview why there has been a long-standing failure to teach questioning and whether it's because we don't think it needs to be taught or we don't know how to teach it. My answer to that is yes and yes, he said. Regarding that first rationale, Rothstein says that questioning is thought of simply as a natural part of speech and something people do instinctively. Many, including Deborah Meyer, feel that kids are born questioners and that we don't need to teach it. We just have to stop discouraging it. But Rothstein maintains that questioning is a more subtle and complex skill than many realize, involving 3 kinds of sophisticated thinking: divergent, convergent, and metacognitive. Some of it comes naturally to kids, but some must be learned and practiced. Since questioning seems to drop off at around age 5, the innate questioning skills we start out with have long been neglected by junior high and high school. By that time, the question asking muscle, as Rothstein calls it, has atrophied and needs to be built up. Can we teach ourselves to question? If the question muscle has atrophied by junior high, imagine its condition by the time a student goes to college. Indeed, Rothstein's downward sloping question asking chart continues to plummet right through the college years. University professors I interviewed confirmed a dearth of student questions, even among bright Ivy Leaguers. For 20 years, I've been teaching at the Harvard Business School, Professor Clayton Christensen told me, and I love this place, but the intuition to ask questions, the curiosity is much less than 20 years ago. As to the cause, if all you do as you're growing up is watch stuff on a screen or go to school where they give you the answers, then you don't develop the instinct for asking questions, Christensen said. They don't know how to ask because it's never been asked of them. William Dershowitz, the acclaimed author and essayist who teaches at Yale University, cited another factor. The college education that students are getting now, particularly at elite institutions, tends to be technocratic, he said. They're trained to develop expertise in a particular area, trained to solve the problems that are particular to that area. It's about jumping through hoops and mastering what's on the test. There's no time where students are asked to step back and think about what they're doing and why they're doing it. What I'm seeing is a failure among those students to ask big questions about values and meaning and purpose. What we really need is for these kids, our future leaders, to learn how to ask those those kinds of questions, and not just technocratic ones. Dershowitz says the best professors can inspire that kind of inquiry, but they're rare. He cites as an example a favorite professor and mentor of his own, about whom Dershowitz has written elegantly. He had a young person's ability to see the world with fresh eyes. His white hair shot up off his forehead like a jolt of discovery. I asked Dershowitz what his professor did to spark that inquiry. He had an ability to reframe things, to ask questions that got at something fundamental. Sometimes the questions almost seemed stupid. There's the idea of the holy fool who asks questions no one else will, and that was part of what he was doing. In doing this, Dershowitz has written his professor was showing us that everything is open to question, especially the things we thought we already knew. Importantly, the professor was also willing to ask questions without knowing the answer. Teachers and professors we think our authority rests on having answers. But students find it really liberating to have a teacher say, I don't know the answer, so let's figure this out together. Is it possible the kind of Socratic thinking that Dershowitz's professor did could make a comeback in the online world? That's what Sebastian Thrun is hoping. Thrun, known for developing Google's self-driving car and other tech breakthroughs, says he was never comfortable asking disruptive questions in his native Germany, but found a much more receptive environment in Silicon Valley. While working at Google, he also taught at Stanford University. In 2011, an artificial intelligence course he co-taught was offered online, and Thrun was surprised to see that tens of thousands signed up for it. Soon after, he made the jump from self-directed cars to self-directed learning. The online university he launched, Udacity, is one of a growing number of such programs that have been attracting attention and mixed reviews in the past few years. But one of the interesting things Thrun is trying to do with Udacity is to bring the Socratic method to online teaching. The Udacity courses are designed not just to broadcast lectures, but to inject thoughtful questioning at critical junctures, to get students thinking about what they're learning. As for encouraging students to ask their own questions, Thrun and one of his partners in the startup, a former Google designer named Irene Oh, insist that questioning is actually easier online because anonymity helps. You don't have to be that person in the back of the huge lecture hall trying to shout out a question at the end of class while others in the room are itching to exit. One college professor recently observed that he'd never gotten as many student questions as when he began teaching online. Yale's Dershowitz is skeptical. He points out the big difference between typing a question in your computer and asking a real-life professor. He also thinks the online college revolution is the first step in dismantling universities to get rid of the overhead of actual classrooms and teachers. He sees no substitute for the collaborative and unpredictable give and take between an assembled group of students and a learned master. You can't improve on Socrates' invention, Dershowitz concludes. Whether or not online courses provide an answer in and of themselves, they are part of a larger phenomenon in which more people of all ages are beginning to direct their own learning, exercising their questioning muscles, and doing so outside the established institutions of learning. Nikhil Goyal thinks this is where the future of learning by inquiry is going to happen. Not in schools. I have no hope that the schools, for the most part, will change, he said, but in makeshift classrooms, often held in maker or hacker spaces where people come together to build and create. John C. Lee Brown holds a similar view. The kids who actually drop out of school or who view that the real learning happens after school, they're becoming part of this massive network of maker movements that is forming. The maker movement is mostly about building things, whether low-tech or high-tech, as well as creating art and music, but it's driven by project-based peer-to-peer learning, which tends to happen as novice makers in the group question the more experienced ones. This is going on in basements, playgrounds, museums. San Francisco's Exploratorium recently established a makerspace, and perhaps most surprisingly in libraries. Libraries are being remade as interesting makerspaces, with the librarian playing more of the role of the teacher of inquiry-based learning, Brown says. Brown believes that young people may be honing better new economy skills outside the classroom than in it. They're learning to create, experiment, build, question, and learn. So it may turn out that in a world of exponential change, these are the kids who will have the skills to rise to the top. In a sense, we're all makers now, or at least we would do well to think of ourselves that way. Whether or not we are ever properly taught how to question, we can develop the skill now on our own, in our own spaces. One way to start is by looking at how other practice questioners do it, focusing in particular on how they employ fundamental why, what if, and how questions to solve problems and create change. All right, that's all of Warren, Berger, A More Beautiful Question that we have for summer reading. So enjoy, reach out with questions, write your questions, do the question work. And we'll circle back around to A.O. Scott next time. Thanks.